We have here today Professor Andrew McKenna from Loyola University, Chicago, who has kindly agreed to talk about his memories that he has of Professor René Girard and how he met René Girard and what kind of an impact René had on him. So let me start off by asking you, when did you first hear about Professor René Girard?
Well, I had never heard of him. I had a fellowship to pursue a doctorate at Johns Hopkins University. And there he was teaching. He was teaching off his first big book, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel. Now, I was addicted to the novel. I love literature with the novel uppermost. And I realized that he had decoded it, it's as if scales fell from my eyes when he talked about modeling, mimesis, and imitation. And mediation. That is to say, that famous triangle of self, other, and the object. And between the self and the object, there are others. And I mean, it just simply blew my mind. His teaching explained to me why I love literature in the first place, with one simple idea. It has three words for it: modeling, mimesis, mediation. And I realized, my goodness, that's why I've always loved great novels. And what's great about them is that they tell the truth about ourselves, to ourselves. And I decided more or less then and there, I would, stay with this curriculum and get a doctorate and go on teaching and writing about literature in a way that I thought was perfectly luminous, clear, concise, and true.
Basically, it was his novel, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, that basically introduced him to you, basically, the class. You were one of his students.
Exactly. Well, I was a student before I read his book. His book had just come out recently, so I had him as a student, and he's talking about the novelists whom I loved, Stendhal, Dostoevsky, and Flaubert. And so, of course, very, very quickly, I bought his book, and I was reading it along with his teaching. And again, it was definitive for me in terms of my career choices and to explain to me, really, in a sense, the love that I had for great literature.
While you were at Johns Hopkins, the famous conference also took place, the Structures Controversy. Were you involved with the conference at all?
Oh, very much so. I had just taken my oral exams, preliminary to going to Paris for a dissertation year. And we were all hanging around the department assigned the task of translating into English papers by some of the important people from France who didn't write in English at all. I was translating Derrida, of all things. I'd never heard of him either. But we were all there, the graduate students, as servers, helpers, discussants. But I got to some of these greats and attend the conference through. And it was, as you know, in terms of the history of this country, it was a very, very important conference in terms of changing the way we think about what's coming across the ocean from Paris. And René had organized it. He had organized it, and he brought together some of the greatest minds from Paris. And again, it was an explosive experience.
Jacques Lacan was there as well as Foucault.
Jacques Lacan was there. Jean-Hippolyte, the great philosopher, was, well, I won't go into the details of Lacan's. Lacan really didn't speak English, but he decided to speak in English. But all the texts were either were mostly delivered in French and then translated simultaneously in English, or they were just read out in English. But you had the greatest people. Roland Barthes was there. You had some of the great minds of that generation. Historically, what is interesting, the very great anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss was invited to talk. But he couldn't accept the invitation. So they reached out here and there, and somebody came up with the name of this guy, Jacques Derrida, who had just published an essay on Lévi-Strauss. So he was invited. And of course, that blew the doors off all kinds of critical, theoretical controversies. And that conference was a founding event in the orientation of the humanities in this country.
Later on, it became known as a very founding conference in literary fields, but at the same time, we can look at it retrospectively as Girard introducing the plague to America.
Yes. Well, to be honest, in a certain sense, he did. Those ideas, post-structuralism, deconstruction, and the philosophy departments were too used to their own kind of conceptual organization. But it really took off in English departments.
Right.
And then, and in a lot of French departments, we contaminated the English departments, and then they contaminated the philosophy departments. It changed the way humanities were being viewed and being written about in humanities departments, both for weal and woe. What I mean is that it produced a lot of very turgid, breathless writing, but it did open the windows. And René didn't agree with all these ideas, but he had written the decisive article saying, listen, we have to get around, get past the same old humanist ideas that, you know, literature or, you know, makes us better humans or anything else like that. Let's get to see how truth it is or what its relation to truth.
This is the book that came out, The Structure is Controversy, based on the conference.
Yes.
Correct?
Mm-hmm.
Do you approve of the book, and do you think it was well put together?
Oh, certainly. I mean, I studied with Derrida. He was a good friend of mine. He was brilliant. He was absolutely stunning. When René was recruited by Buffalo, Eugenio went with him. And yes, I mean, I haven't read the book in, you know, quite some time, etc. But it is a foundational text because, for instance, in the audience, you had this man nobody had ever heard, Paul Lamont. At the time, he was teaching at Cornell.
Yeah.
Well, then he became famous and he started teaching at Yale and English departments, including my own.
René was your dissertation advisor at Johns Hopkins, correct?
Oh, yes, absolutely. You see, after having him one semester in teaching, I realized that I could ever only be the better from learning from this man. So I took all his courses and I asked him to direct my dissertation. By the way, so did everybody else.
What did you write your dissertation on, if I may
Well, I was going to write it on Flaubert and Sartre. Flaubert had written a certain number of things about Sartre. Sartre had written a certain number of things about Flaubert. And René said, you know, don't do this, because if Sartre comes out with his big bad book on Flaubert, you'll have to revise the whole thing. I decided to write on Baudelaire and Sartre. Sartre wrote a very nasty little book about Baudelaire. And I wrote an essay for that class saying, they said, it's a nasty little book. He says terrible things about Baudelaire, but so does Baudelaire say about himself. And that Baudelaire has scooped Sartre, so to speak. So it became a study in comparative analysis, which went over phenomenology, existentialism, literature, art, and it certainly, you know, widened the specter of my readings. And well, it was well done. It was thought to be well done.
Right.
But I didn't have the oomph or whatever. At that time, I started writing articles about deconstruction, post-structuralism, and Girard, and have been, you know, spent a long time doing that. And then when I wrote my book, well, that was really to get deconstruction and post-structuralism, if you will, out of my system. You know?
I see.
I had done a lot of work on Derrida. I owe him a great debt. How to think about philosophy, see philosophy as a text and not a series of concepts or principles. But I also knew that it was a dead end. And that when, and René pointed out the basic thing about Derrida in Violence in the Sacred, when he said that Derrida, he sees it as an ongoing sacrificial crisis. And I realized, well, yes, really, that's the point. That's the key point about philosophy is always undoing itself for a foundation it could never, ever find.
How long did you take to write the book? Was it an easy book or was it a difficult book to write?
Well, both. It started out to look easy. I had written a number of articles on Girard and Derrida. So what we do in the profession is we, you know, put them all up again, one against another. And I knew that the key idea was that Derrida deconstruction is very important, but it's important for reasons that only Girard can really make sense out of. And so what was difficult about dealing with Derrida's prose, you know, it's read in French. It translates very, very badly. And sort of trying to paraphrase that. A very famous friend of René, Michel Serre, said in print that he said, you know, the ideas of Girard can be understood by an 11-year-old child. And that is true. An 11-year-old understands modeling and imitation and the ideas about them. But the ideas of Derrida have to be translated English to English to English in order to get the connections with Girard. The connection is always this. At the core of Derrida's thinking is sacrificial expulsion. But he doesn't use the word sacrifice. He keeps winding around and around and around, and he deconstructs Lévi-Strauss and Saussure and even Heidegger, etc. And doesn't ever get to the narrative dimension that his own history of philosophy unveils as a sacrificial crisis. The sacrificial crisis, by the way, simply is a crisis of difference. What's true, what's false, what's good, what's bad, including what's good to believe and what's not good to believe.
The deconstructionists claim that there is no center, as you know, there is no truth. So it's always at a play. So they're always using the text and the subtext to basically, like Paul Demon's controversy, to prove exactly what they want to say using the text. So did you have any difficulty dealing with Derrida's texts, which is so shaky?
Well, dealing with his text, he was a great French prose writer, and he was very aware of that. Dealing with this text was very challenging, and dealing with the translations, which couldn't, catch his style and some of the more important nuances. My dealings with Derrida, I also attended his seminar in Paris, but I was surrounded by Derridians. I was the only Girardian in the pack.
Right.
I talked with Derrida, but as soon as I would mention the name of Girard, well, if that's what you're interested in, this conversation, can continue, and so eventually the conversation.
Was there any rivalry between Derrida and Girard?
Derrida was the king of French thought in Paris. Derrida, Foucault, Lacan, Roland Barthes, etc. And that's like what the French call a chapel. And they're all sort of jockeying for their packed position. And it's Parisian intellectualism is tremendously rivalrous and therefore tremendously mimetic. René's great gift or great idea was to just pull out of that and to come to, teach in this country. But that people in rivalry don't admit they're in rivalry. They say, I'm right, and you're wrong. They just, no, but seriously, rivalry is the last thing we want to admit to. That what we're doing really is we're doing something because we're always looking at somebody else over our shoulder and jockeying for position. So that the rivalry was built into Parisian intellectual life. Derrida never wrote a line about Girard. And I think that silence is very telling because he was I think he had a sense that his thinking was too close to Girard, but he wanted to have his own label on things. Now that's not nice insinuation, so I won't pursue it. But that certainly Girard was the one big, strong Parisian French intellectual powerhouse whom Derrida did not write about. But he knocked off Foucault, he knocked off Lacan, he took out Lévi-Strauss. You see what I mean? Rivalry is irresistible, especially in a hot house climate among Parisians.
René's thought is so huge and it's so big that I don't think Derrida can really compare. It's like a drop compared to René's thought, which covers anthropology and literature and theology.
That is exactly. What I mean is, as of things hidden since the foundation of the world, I picked up in Paris in 1979 when I was there attending Derrida's seminar. It became clear that this is the theory of everything. It's a theory of evolution, it's a theory of cultural foundations, organization, it's a theory of history, etc. And the Girardians among us, myself, have just gone with various aspects or disciplinary applications of that theory. Derrida was very sort of narrowly textual and philosophical, and little by little he sort of spread his wings, and he began to write about things like hospitality, because people in the seminar, they said, well, if this is true, what do we do, how do we demonstrate, how do we take this down to the street? And he was sensitive to that. He was an ethical man. If I have something to say, it has to, be something that, more than seminar students need to hear. But of course, the way he said it didn't make it very available. Whereas precisely René's writings was always clear, compact, and concise.
Let me ask you, Professor McKenna, during all these years, I guess you're probably one of his oldest students still alive.
That is a fact. Yes.
So,
I always call myself my second oldest student. His oldest.
So who was the first?
Eric Gons.
Eric Gons.
Eric Gons. And Eric has built a whole library and a whole career and a whole theoretical apparatus, beginning with Girard and expressing his own paper. But he was 3 years ahead of me at Hopkins, so I never got to meet him. His first big book on language was sent to me as a manuscript, and I was told by the editor, well, this looks very difficult, and I read it, and I realized, oh no, he gets it. Eric took off a paragraph in Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World about signs and differences, and developed his own theory. And I stayed with Eric's ideas. They're very important. And Eric himself is again and again saying that it's moi et René, it's not like me against René.
So throughout all these years, can you share with us maybe one or two good memories you have of René?
Yeah, well, I have many. I had the luxury of hosting the cover conference, the Colloquium on Violence and Religion at my university. So I got to, host René and Martha and all my best Girardian friends from various corners of the universe. I never missed an opportunity to confer or converse with him when I attended various conferences, where he was speaking or at the cover conference. But the most important thing for me precisely was really that he was disseminating, and that worked for me. Things Hidden Since the Foundation made it possible for me and others I could cite to be a thinking Christian. To be Christian is still thinking, not just going by faith or just going with miracles or any kind of sort of blind adherence and everything else like that. So I'll give you one anecdote because it's the last one really. In writing, I would send René my off-prints, and he was kind enough from time to time, he would send me a signed copy of his books. And his last book was Achevé Clausewitz, Battling to the End. We were there at a seminar at Stanford, hosted by Imitatio, which is the group formed through Peter Thiel through the study and publication of René's ideas. So we're sitting around the book, and they were passing out the first copies of the translation of the book. And I thought, well, I already have the French, I can buy the book. And he's sitting right there. So I said, I'll take one too. And he grabbed it, and he wrote on the flyleaf, or the inside jacket, he said, Pour André, l'amitié croît avec le temps, which means, for Andrew, our friendship has grown with time. I couldn't have asked for anything better than that. His friendship was very valuable to me. His recognition of it was priceless. But it was precisely because the importance of his work for me, for my teaching, for my research, for my outlook on the world. At a later meeting in Stanford, he was leaving in the car with Martha, and he had Martha stop, and he opened the window and said, hello, goodbye again. So yes, we had a friendship, but it was not the personal friendship that mattered most to me. The fact is that he had the keys to the kingdom, certainly the kingdom of literature. And I mean, this whole theory of culture, literature, and history making sense. Now, we have to try to make sense as we can if we're professors. And that was his gift to the world and to me.
What's your favorite book of his? Do you have a favorite?
Mm-hmm. Well,
I think I know which one it is. He's probably going to say Deceit, Desire, the novel.
Yes, because it's the one that first introduced me to this whole new possibility of studying literature. And it's a very eloquent book. And it has a style, a rhetorical style, which is deliciously critical and wonderfully humorous, if you will. Not that the other books don't exhibit humor, but René's innate sense of humor strides through the prose of that book. So it has an aesthetic pleasure for me that the other books have here and there or only incidentally, etc. So yeah, that's my first favorite, but I've never reread any of them in English or French without deriving new insights and a great intellectual.
His last book came as a surprise and a shock for me. I was not
Yep.
expecting it. How was your reaction to Battling to the End?
Well, it came as a surprise and a shock to lots of people, even among his followers, etc. And I won't go into those details, but it struck me as just right. When it came out in French, you know, I wrote it. Anything when his book came out, I would read it, devour it, and study it. And I wrote to him and said, "At last, René, you're giving us," and he uses the expression, "histoire mimétique," you're giving us mimetic history. What I mean is that if something we're calling mimetic theory is true about, if it's true about cultural organization, then it has to be true about history as well. If it can make sense of my relationship, my rivalry and my competition and my self-hatred and all those other things, and then it also has to make sense across time through institutions. And his book was a grandiose gesture. It made perfect sense to me, and I've drawn a lot from it ever since.
I wasn't expecting such an apocalyptic book at the end of his life. I had heard that he was going to write a book on St. Paul, and
Yes.
that felt more Girard-like.
Well, yes, it is an apocalyptic book, and that's what really shocked some of his more irenic Girardian friends, etc. But you know, by the way, it's not simply an apocalypse. It says, well, we have to have hope, you know, but it's mostly an apocalyptic. For reason, by the way, he explains in another book, in the book translated as Evolution and Conversion.
Evolution and Conversion, yes.
Okay, fine. And he said, well, I write about violence mostly, which is mostly a negative effect. And so there's a lot of negativity about, the things that I write about. Well, the Battling to the End is an apocalyptic. Back where we are right now, etc. We're in a worldwide crisis, another crisis of difference. Who are us? Who are them? What's true? What's false? Is there not science, etc. So, by the way, it was Sandy Goodhart who first insisted on the fact that even his first book, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, is a prophetic book. And it is. And as I reread those ringing pages, including the humorous ones, I get more sense of that as I reread, say, the prophets of Israel. And Battling to the End is an apocalyptic book. It's a prophetic book. Because he sees the whole world hurtling towards a violence which will never claim as its own,
In your opinion, does it offer any solution in this apocalyptic time?
When he writes about Dostoevsky, all Dostoevsky's books are apocalyptic. And right. Dostoevsky sees culture going, either to salvation or self-destruction. And so people would ask René, and he would say, well, have two models, your neighbor or Jesus. They're the positive solution, which is always on offer.
Right.
But you have to slash through or cut or dry out or get rid of all the negativity in order to see it.
Well, thank you so much, Professor McKenna, for your time and for agreeing to share your thoughts and memories on René, and I really appreciate it.
Certainly has been a pleasure for me to be back, and it's good to talk to you again.